it's important for us to approach neuroscience by shaving with Occam's razor while sailing in Van Neurath's boat. And we can't really rip it down per se, but I think that a particular type of naturalistic parsimony is important. Adhering to Quine, adhering to Dewey, but doing so in a way that appreciates what this new knowledge is and how we know it. Indeed, as you heard this morning, and we'll hear throughout the course of the day, neuroscience as a science, qua scientia, utilizes particular forms of ways of knowing. It's methodologically sound in that regard. And thus, we must appreciate that, as any science, part of that philosophical construct is that it must be self-critical and self-revisionist. As such, we see shifting architectonics of neuroscience that help to define not only what we know, but also help to define how we know it. Neuroscience as both lens into the brain, mind, and also as mirror, which then allows us to then navigate that point of appropriation and what neuroscience both entails and obtains with regard to its situation, not only as an academic discipline, but more conciliately as part of the social milieu. Indeed, what you've heard is that it speaks to neuroscience as being contributory to, and in many ways answering, the perdurable questions of philosophy. And in some ways, much of that is being advanced through a group of neuroscientists and philosophers who approach this new and somewhat incipient field that has been termed neurophilosophy.
I appreciate that introduction because it saves me the need of having to explain why Paul Churchill was so important to all this. Those of us who are concerned about Paul, who believe computational neuroscience revealed that the pragmatists were right, do have to deal with the fact that Paul has recently appeared to reject it, or tried to reject pragmatism, or at least some form of pragmatism. He says, pragmatists define truth as behavioral success. Crudely, a true proposition is one that works. And then he says, while I am at least a closet pragmatist, I balk at any such direct definition of the sort proposed. And he gives three reasons for balking. First of all, he says there's the issue of the vagueness of behavioral success. What does that mean anyway? Well, I don't think this is a real problem for him because truth is an equally vague term as far as Paul is concerned, and truth and success could be closely related prototypes with overlapping borders, and that would fit his system just fine. In fact, he even says in Neurocomputational Perspective, that his earlier work, that truth might even be eliminated in future epistemologies. We might not even think in terms of truth. And in fact, I think to some degree he has already done that, and I agree with a lot of his developments in that. Secondly, he says, this is my rephrasing of one very cryptic sentence in that passage, factors in a successfully behaving system have truth value only if they are cognitive. So if you've got a successful behavioral system, parts of it are going to be cognitive. Let's say you've got somebody who's playing basketball. The hand-to-eye coordination is cognitive. That's part of the reason they're successful. They've got that, but also height is going to be a reason that will make them a successful basketball player. And, you know, it looks like if all things that lead to successful behavior are cognitive, you can't make this distinction between these two. It seems important. Are the pragmatists forced to ignore this distinction? Well, Paul basically ends up keeping this distinction by distancing himself somewhat from pragmatism. Basically, he ends up retreating to a kind of mind-brain identity theory, or rather never having left a kind of mind-brain identity theory, by giving content to what he calls semantic state spaces, which are particular computational regions in the brain. And that puts him in opposition with those of us who are often labeled with the hypothesis of extended cognition, supporters of that. This little rogues gallery includes Tony Chimera, who's with us here today, also Rob Wilson, Andy Clark, myself, and Alvin Noe. We're more likely to think in terms of content perhaps extending out into the world, such as what Andy Clark calls scaffolding, or, as Tony Chimera says, even reject the idea of representation altogether and think we ought to use some other concepts for making sense of cognition. Also, that puts him at odds with the pragmatists, because for reasons that I explain, devote most of chapter 10 of my book to, pragmatism and extended cognition are very, very closely related to each other. Now, the answer, however, to this charge that you can't draw this line is that, well, look, you get cases like the one I just gave you. Sure, it looks like you can draw a clear line, but there are lots of other hard cases in the middle where the line isn't that clear. And the fact that pragmatism cannot make sharp distinctions where none exists should be seen as a virtue. There is this distinction that various people have been criticizing us HEC theorists have been giving, which is this distinction between coupling and constitution. It's similar to the distinction I make in my book called causation versus embodiment. The assumption is there's this long chunk of stuff, of activities that are just coupled to an experience, but there are only another set that cause the experience. And this seems intuitively obvious, but when you try to draw the distinction, unless you're willing to just sort of arbitrarily draw a line around whatever happens in the brain and say that that constitutes the experience and the others couple, everything else that makes it is responsible for the experience is coupled to it, unless you're willing to just draw the line like that, you can't really make the distinction that clearly. And I want to give an example of this. Paul gives an example in Neurophilosophy and Works, which he thinks clearly illustrates the distinction. I want to show that it's not as clear as it looks. He talks about a GPS, which is what got me here today, which is in this iPhone right now, as well as in expensive rail cars, as he said in a somewhat earlier book. He says that basically inside the GPS there are a bunch of little maps, and the satellite system triggers and lets you know which of the little maps is related to where you are right now. And he says the fact that the content is really contained in there is supported by, among other things, the fact that you could hook it up to something else other than the satellite system. You could hook the GPS up maybe to a bunch of video cameras spread all over the planet or something like that. And he says it would still function the same way. That's what he's saying. And so therefore we've got a nice neat line between the narrow content and the GPS and all the causal, coupled stuff, causal stuff that's coupled to it. Well, my response to this is armchair philosophy. And we know how Paul feels about armchairs used as philosophical tools. It's amazing. You type in smashing chairs into Google, Google image search, and you can find anything. Now, my objection to this point here is that for the armchair is, why is this armchair philosophy? Well, there's no citations here to any, technical work on GPSs. Why is he so sure that GPSs work that way? I don't think they do work that way. I don't know anything about the topic either, but I think it's equally plausible that they could work by some sort of cloud computing. Maybe what you've got is the GPS is actually some kind of sort of just a readout thing, and all the real work is being done in some sort of computer cloud. And I refer to this as a Gibsonian computer cloud because this was pretty much the way Gibson said that the visual system worked. He says that an awful lot of the processing of the visual system was actually offloaded into the light array, and maybe that's the way our brains work. And maybe it's, maybe it's all in one, maybe it's all in the other. It's clearly a lot of important cognitive stuff is happening in the brain, but just to claim it automatically must all be in the brain begs the question. And furthermore, to make this even more dramatic, if you hooked up a visual system, the GPS to a camera system, you can't just hook it up and expect it to work just fine. You're going to get hash. You're going to get something like this if you do this. I've worked a lot with audio equipment. I've had this experience. You get experiences like this, audio hash rather than visual hash, but I can't put that on a PowerPoint slide. In order to make it actually work, you've got to come up with all sorts of symbiotic relationships between the camera system and what's going on inside the GPS to make it actually work like a GPS, which means that you're going to, in fact, have to spread the cognition out through the whole system and not just keep it inside the GPS. The reason we have a tendency to think this way is that you can't do this with most of the electronics we've got. And I imagine Paul was basically comparing this, did some sort of abductive inference, as it were, to the fact that you can get yourself a CD player, and you really can't say, well, all the information is stored in the CD and the rest of the system is just sort of coupled to it. And that's because you can unplug the CD player and put in a cassette player or your iPhone or anything else that will, and so that really gives sense, well, the narrow content really is in the CD player. But there's just no reason to assume that that kind of modularity is present in a biological system. This is an economic artifact that just arose from the fact that we like to separate our CD players and buy something else, because they keep updating stuff every 15 minutes. Now, so this modularity, in other words, comes from the fact that, this system is portable. Now, the pragmatists actually did say that really what representation was an issue of portability. if you've got yourself a cognitive system, you can pick up a piece of the cognitive system and move it to another cognitive system, you think, okay, now we've got a representation. And you know, one thing we do know, the fact is nobody really knows what a representation is. People keep talking about this all the time, and if you're denying that the system has representations in it, you're presupposing that you know what a representation is also. Everybody knows that isomorphism is a necessary product, property of a representation, but there are lots of isomorphisms out there that aren't representations. It may very well be that if you've got a portable isomorphism, that's all there is to representations. And if it's the case, and you know, as I was saying earlier, if it turns out that the isomorphisms in an actual living cognitive system aren't portable because there's no economic reason for them to be portable, it may very well be that Tony Chimera was right, and maybe we shouldn't be talking about representations in a cognitive system. By and large, I don't agree with him on that most of the time. But as I've been thinking about this, if there's anything, if that's all there is to a cognitive system, to a representation is portability, and we have no portability in biological systems, then maybe he's right. Maybe we don't have representations in our biological systems. Okay, the third thing that Paul was objecting to was this idea that we need to have, we need to be able to explain behavioral success, not just refer to it. If we define or identify what counts as truth or as knowledge in terms of the behavioral successes it produces, then we will not be able to give a non-trivial explanation of those behavioral successes. So what he's doing is he's basically interpreting, there's a kind of a similarity between Peirce's idea that a true statement is nothing, a true theory is nothing but the true individual applications, and making it kind of similar to saying the only thing that a mind is a bundle of, you know, behavioral stimulus and response links. And basically, so this is kind of like equating behaviorism and pragmatism. A lot of people do that, and I've always found this strange because I hate behaviorism and I really like pragmatism. But, you know, it's understandable though. I mean, I don't think the Dewey believed this, but maybe James and Peirce were kind of like Skinner on this point. Peirce's original description of this idea, you know, our concept of these practical effects, practical is my insert in there, is the whole of our conception of the object. That's kind of like James's theory of cash value. And, you know, if the pragmatists thought this, they were wrong. You know, when we're bringing the pragmatists into neuroscience, we're going to have to trump something, and, you know, the pragmatists were kind of vague about a lot of issues. If you do end up doing this, you're going to end up with basically an Aristotelian science. You're basically going to say you've got a laundry list of dispositions, and that's supposed to, you know, a series of individual occurrences of, you know, truthiness is going to give you your, you know, your true statement. You need more than that. You need something behind the dispositions to explain it. But there's more to pragmatism than this. Church's closet pragmatism provides both empirical justification and philosophical clarification of positions the pragmatists proposed and the so-called realists rejected. And so basically the rest of this talk is going to be trying to get this closet pragmatism out of the closet and into the streets. Now, first of all, the pragmatists had a very different idea about the relationship between knowing how and knowing that than the classical view. Basically, this Sellers quoted, he was not, you know, advocating this, but he was quoting this as a position quite widely believed by many people. It can be argued that anything which can be properly called knowing how to do something presupposes a body of knowledge that, or to put it differently, knowledge of truth and or facts. So this view basically says we know how to do stuff because we have books in our heads. We've got these facts in our heads. And Fodor actually both endorsed and ridiculed this position, as he often does with a lot of positions, of saying, well, we've got a little man inside our head, and he's got all these books on the shelf, and one of them says how to tie your shoes. You take the book down, you read the instructions, and that's how you tie your shoes. And so you can't, in other words, know how to do something unless you have some sort of knowing that knowledge. Well, Dewey said that was exactly backwards, and what we learned about pragmatism has shown that Dewey was right. The brain and the nervous system are primarily organs of action undergoing. Cognitive experience must originate within that of a non-cognitive sort. So here you've got a couple of state spaces, you know, that map roughly, crudely, how certain kinds of knowing activities would work. You've got a perceptual space going in from those eyeballs in there that goes through there. You flow there through a behavioral space which connects up to some, you know, motors that move various muscles. No words in here anywhere. And basically what happens is if you're going to make yourself a system, that has knowing that ability, you've got to build it out of this. And everybody recognizes that this is what you've got to do. You've got to build it out of this. So this means that knowing how systems are more fundamental than knowing that system. We make knowing how that systems out of knowing how systems, not the other way around. Secondly, there was this distinction between knowledge and experience that Dewey thought was extremely important. Sellers/Rorty says all awareness is linguistic affairs, so if that's the case, it's knowledge all the way down. Experience is not something different in kind than knowledge. You know what I've got here is Rorty with a little sort of Salesian homunculus growing out of his back. This phrase does come from Sellers. This is a direct quote from Sellers. But Sellers was very, very aware that this statement was not as unproblematic as Rorty. Rorty just embraces this statement unconditionally, but in a lot of Sellers' later work, he admitted that there were some problems with this. He didn't have any solutions to those problems. He didn't think it was his place to do so. He thought future people would. So that's what we're doing now. Dewey, in response to this idea that all awareness is a linguistic affair, said to be a smell is one thing, to be known as a smell is another, to be a feeling is one thing, to be known as a feeling is another. Now, if you start talking about this idea that experience can't be reduced to knowledge, to a lot of people this looked like dualism, and a lot of people criticized Dewey for this, for being some sort of quasi-dualist. He said he wasn't a dualist, and with what we now know about neuroscience, we can actually save him from dualism if we interpret his distinction this way. Knowledge is verbal knowing, what he called knowledge is verbal knowing that knowledge. And that kind of knowledge is objective because it inhabits the social space of reasons. You can put that kind of knowledge in a book. I can read the book, and I can learn stuff and learn how to do things by means of that. So that's out there in the objective world. Whereas experience is created by the vector transformations of state space that are actually happening in our own biological systems, what most people would refer to as the brain, which of course is where a lot of it is happening, but I don't think where all of that is happening. But you know, Paul, who does think most of it's happening in there, Paul Churchland, basically used this kind of distinction to criticize Frank Jackson's Mary argument, the idea that there are certain aspects of Mary's experience of seeing color that can't be translated into knowledge. Well, Paul said, this is really not a matter of supporting dualism. It just says, it just supports the fact that the brain uses more modes and media of representation than the simple storage of sentences. So basically, you could sort of substitute state space semantics, which is, or semantic state spaces, which turn out to be basically do the same function that Dewey's concept of experience is. So for both Churchland and Dewey, experience / semantic state spaces is capable of sophisticated cognitive functions without needing language, and that's why we have what is often referred to as tacit knowing. You know, we know how to do stuff, but we can't explain how we do it. You know, if you work with rock musicians, you run a lot of people who are in that situation. But on the other hand, it doesn't work the other way. Language cannot function without experience or semantic state spaces, and that's because embodied goal-directed activity is needed to create relationships between perceptual state spaces and behavioral state spaces. And this is, this kind of embodied activity is what actually semantically connects our language to the world. Both Dewey and Churchland believe that, and I think it's absolutely spot on. This is one of the reasons, for example, that Dewey thought that you had to do activity in school. You had to be solving problems and doing things. You couldn't just cram the facts into your head so that you can later mark them out on bubble tests to prove that you've learned something. So that means that Churchland's neurophilosophy thus gives us a version of Dewey's distinction with firm scientific support. Also, and this is probably the part of pragmatism that bothers people more than anything else, and this is the idea that there is a continuity between truth and error. When I was actually trying to define Churchland as a pragmatist in one of my earlier papers, a paper which I submitted to about a dozen journals and never got published, although it's been cited several times from conference since then. Basically, when I tried to make Churchland into a pragmatist, they said, one of the peer reviewers said, well, if you'd use this as a reductio ad absurdum, if you'd use this to prove that Churchland obviously can't believe this or it must be wrong because it leads to pragmatism, we might have considered publishing this. But if you're going to say that somebody is really going to be a pragmatist, that's too crazy. Nobody's going to want to do that. And I got that comment like 2 or 3 times in peer review, actually. And that's because you got this one quote here, I think, which shows out this point. Incompletely unified appearance is the only form that reality may yet have achieved. That's from the pluralistic universe. And if you remove an awful lot of the modifiers, that's basically saying that appearance is reality. There isn't that much difference between appearance and reality. But it follows from the basic pragmatist idea that truth is whatever works. Because if that's true, and it's also a fact that no theory works perfectly, and every theory that anyone has seriously adopted works at least part of the time. I mean, even Ptolemaic astronomy still worked great for navigation. So it's got some truth value. So we end up with a continuum theory of truth. We end up with something like Stephen Colbert's idea of truthiness, where things have varying amounts of truth, and you don't have this binary, truth is what refers to things that are out there, and falsity is things that refer to stuff between your ears. You've got this continuum, which is another reason why I think that the pragmatists have to accept something like extended cognition, between true theories and false theories. Now, this is exactly what Churchland advocates is in a neurocomputational perspective. He claims that although there is no such thing as the truth from a neurocomputational point of view, there is such a thing as learning. Learning in a neural network is defined not as eliminating error, but as decreasing it. As you tune a neural network using the delta rule, its response to its inputs is changing, quote, in a fashion that systematically reduces the error messages to a trickle. But nothing guarantees that there exists a possible configuration of weights that would reduce the error message to zero. So what we're trying to do is sort of increase the truthiness of our networks by removing the errors. And when we get a small enough number of errors, on believing a particular assumption, we say that is now a true statement. Now, is there some way perhaps of saving this absolute truth distinction, which all my peer reviewers thought was so important? Maybe. Could there be an error-free network? Maybe there could be such a way that you've got a network that was so perfectly errored so that it would make no mistakes, and none of us would ever make any more mistakes again. And yeah, if we found such a thing, we could say that this network was the truth and all the others were false. This is my answer to the thing goes, hey, you're saying that pragmatism is true, but aren't you saying that it only works, that it isn't really true? How can pragmatism be saying it's truth? There's no such thing as truth. Well, pragmatists can't prove that this error-free network isn't going to come down from the sky somewhere and give us the truth. But we don't need an epistemology that only creates honorifics for a theory we have never seen and are probably never going to see. That has no cash value, as James would say. We need an epistemology that enables us to tell the difference between our best theories and our not so good theories. And a theory based on connectionist vector transformations, if we get truth by fine-tuning our vectors like that, that gives a very good neurocomputational support for that theory of truth. Okay, now, there's also this concept. James claimed this wasn't the same thing as pragmatism. You could be a radical empiricist and not be a pragmatist, but this was clearly a very strong part of the whole pragmatist project. Dewey coined the term sensationalistic empiricism to make a distinction between the kind of experience that Hume believed in, experience consisting of discrete sense data, little 3x5 bits of information that come into your brain one at a time, and then the mind has got to assemble these into unified experiences. Dewey said that the project went exactly opposite, that our experiences are fundamentally unified, and it's analysis, not synthesis, which is the cognitive achievement. In other words, we start with a totally unified, blooming, buzzing confusion, and then we divide it up into smaller and smaller parts. Well, guess what? That's exactly the way a connectionist system works. Now here is Paul Churchland's famous mind rock inner space that controls a neural net that makes a distinction between minds and rocks. Any signal that appears in this region of the computational space would be a rock, and anything that appears over here would be a mind. Well, let's suppose we wanted to make this rather simple-minded binary system, and we want to make it somewhat smarter. Well, what we can do is, we could, let's say, train it to be able to identify some other output as identifying coral, so that you can tell the difference between coral and other rocks. Well, what's it going to do? How do you describe a neural net that's been retrained to do that? You divide off the computational space and say this region over here is coral, that region is non-coral. Similarly, suppose you want to tell the difference between plastic mines and metal mines. Well, you train it to recognize plastic mines. You divide off the region, in effect, through that training process, so that now you've got the region is divided up into plastic and metal. So this system is getting smarter and smarter, but it's not getting smarter by dumping more and more facts into it and putting them together. It's starting with this fundamental unity and dividing it up into smaller and smaller parts, which is exactly what the radical empiricists said was happening with experience. So, with this kind of theory, these little boxes here are not going to be little boxes that you're supposed to dump sense data into. a baby at the very beginning of its life, or maybe this happens at the fetal stage. That's an empirical question I can't fully answer. But what I would say is that at that point, the baby doesn't even make a distinction between itself and the rest of the world. It's a totally, what the Taoists would call an uncarved block. And then what happens, as the baby gets smarter, it eventually realizes that, oh, let's divide that block into me and everything else, and then there's me and mom, and then there's me and mom's breast, and the rest of the world. And so its knowledge increases by dividing the world up into more and more parts. And real simple systems like the frog here, frogs do not have the ability to perceive things that don't move. They can only perceive moving objects, and they can only tell whether they're big or little, and they basically, their perceptual space divides things up into big and little, and basically it connects to a behavioral space. The big, so if you see something big, that sends a signal to run. If you see something little, you eat it, and that's basically the extent of its cognitive system. And the frog, if we want to start with a simple system like this and make it smarter and smarter, we'd start with this large unified block, and we divide it up into smaller and smaller pieces, which is just what the radical empiricists said we'd be doing. Also, the pragmatists not only were holists epistemologically, they were also holists ontologically as well. They really believed that the universe was fundamentally a process and that objects emerged from the interactions of this process, rather than that the processes were created by objects, bumping into each other in various ways. Now, Churchland does, in Neurophilosophy at Work, he does a similar kind of what he calls a reduction, but because he's trying to answer the people that say, oh, well, look, there's multiple realizability between biology and physics, or between psychology and physics. He says, look, there's the same kind of multiple realizability that happens in, in physics as well, because sound is a bunch of waves, but the waves can travel through a variety of substrates. It can travel through air, it can travel through water, it can travel through rock. Temperature is also molecular motion. It follows the same laws of molecular motion, but in lots of different kinds of substances. Magnetic fields will also follow the same kind of laws, but those laws will be the same whether you're doing it through copper or iron or any other kinds of magnetic metal. Now, the thing is, though, that's not really reductionism, because the purpose of reductionism is, he calls it reduction, but it's really, what you're doing in reductionism is you're starting with a brain, you're explaining what the brain is doing in terms of its parts, the neurons, you're explaining what the neurons do in terms of their parts, the chemicals, you explain the chemicals in terms of their parts, the atoms, and everything is supposed to be controlled by this underlying substrate. But Paul is saying that the underlying substrate is just a medium, it's basically causally inert, and so therefore what we've really got is an overarching pattern which is controlling things. So this is not reductionism at all. It's actually a kind of holism that says it's the big pattern, not the parts, that are controlling things. He even at one point says, in a parentheses, Plato would have approved. So, in neuroscience, the mathematics of vector transformation is used to measure various variations in neural voltages. Nothing wrong with that, but there's no reason that the same mathematics can't be used to measure relationships between other dynamically related factors in the body or world. So neuroscience should be treated as a substrate for the field-based laws of abstract physics, which are doing the real cognitive work that is only approximately described by talk about neurons. And once you start seeing that these kind of vector transformations are doing the real cognitive work, there's no reason to assume that the ones in the neurons are any more special than those in the rest of the cognitive system. It's all just, you've got to start using dynamics rather than neuroscience as your fundamental understanding of the way the mind works. And so this is not a reduction, it's rather an affirmation of the holism that was the central metaphysical epistemological position of pragmatism. And if neuropragmatism transforms itself into a kind of post-neural dynamic pragmatism, we will have yet one more scientific proof that the pragmatists were right. Thank you.